we're pleased to have Liz Delgado and Annie Harrison, who are going to be speaking, who are healthcare lecturers with the Hub at the University of Manchester. And they'll also be joined by Anne Amna Jamaluddin, who's a participant in the research project. So over to the team. Thank you.
Hi. I'm just going to share the screen. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Sorry, I just have to go to the, there we go, from beginning.
Yeah.
There we go. Great, thank you very much. So thanks to Claire for chairing the session and for Micra for inviting us. And hopefully our final speaker, Anne, will make it in while I'm talking.
Lovely. Annie, can you pop that into slideshow mode, please?
Somebody give me advice on how to do that.
If you can just see at the bottom of the screen,
yeah,
near where the volume is, there's a little icon.
Is it that one?
Perfect. We're there. Thank you.
Is that working now? Because mine's disappeared.
We can see, no, it's gone. Next slide. We can see two, we can see two slides. The first one on the left, and you've got your next slide on the right.
I'm sorry, I don't know what to do about that.
Try, I think you're fine there because we can just see the slide you're about to talk about and the next one. That's
all right, so just ignore the next one. Okay, thank you very much, Claire. So just to introduce the project came about because of Liz's concern and work with carers, and because of my interest in the issues of rurality. And these two things came together in our concern about the impact that COVID restrictions were going to have on informal carers of people with dementia in rural areas. So we wanted to capture their experience, and given that we didn't know how the pandemic would develop, we wanted to identify any learning that would be useful if there were future pandemic restrictions. We also wanted to find out how lived experience of informal carers compared to UK government guidelines on support for informal carers of people with dementia. We were interested in finding out the experience of rural carers, as they are generally further from all services, not just care services. And we were concerned that their experience may have been more challenging than the experience of people who were closer to services in urban areas. We used a participatory research method called photoelicitation, which involves the use of photographs as prompts in qualitative interviews, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. And the photos that we're using in this presentation, most of the photographs are from our participants, photographs that they produced in the project, though we're not always using them in the same way that the participants intended. I'm sorry, I've got a call from the other presenter. I'm just gonna. Oh, she's gone. Okay. Yeah, we're not always using the photographs in the way that participants intended. So we created an interdisciplinary research team, which is made up from people from public health and from humanities. And amongst our research team, we had people who have an academic interest in dementia and lived experience as carer, and also as a provider of services to carers. And we're really grateful to the Centre for Ageing Better for funding this research in partnership with Micra. So the project began in March 2021, and data collection began, in February 2021, and data collection began in March 2021 and continued until November. And since then, we've been conducting analysis of the data. So I chose this photograph as the opening photograph for the presentation because it expresses, for me, it expresses the range of data that we collected So the raven, which is painted on this tree, can be seen as a kind of malevolent or threatening force. But the green shoots on the tree express a sense of hope. And I think what Liz and I both found was that that what we heard from informal carers was a real mix between the difficulties of their work, of their experience, and the challenges of their experience as carers, but also kind of positive messages and a sense of creativity and hope. And that's what we hope we'll get across in the presentation. So the next slide is over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Annie. So yeah, the project was only funded for a short time, for 6 months, and we did find recruitment to be very challenging in the middle of lockdown. And as a result of lockdown, obviously carers were a lot more isolated during the pandemic, and so many support organisations had either closed or moved online. And previously, what we'd done with similar projects is actually recruited through those support services and those organisations. So we kind of lost that ability to recruit through the gatekeepers like we had done previously. So we had less opportunity to promote the project through them. And as a result of that, we did struggle with recruitment at first. So we kind of had discussion with the rest of the research team, as Annie said, which included carers with lived experience. And then we decided to amend our ethics approval to extend the time period for data collection. So we also expanded our geographical criteria. So originally we were just going to focus on a semi-rural area in West Yorkshire, but we decided to expand that to any rural area in the UK. And we also amended our age inclusion criteria, because originally we had decided to use the formal definition of an older person for an older informal carer, which is 60 years plus. But we'd had contact off a couple of people who were a bit younger. So we decided to change the age range to over 50 instead of over 60, or 50 years and older instead of 60 years and older. Despite making those changes, we still were only able to recruit 3 participants. So we then expanded our participant criteria to include people who actually run support groups for informal carers or organisations. And we thought it'd be a nice way as well to get some more insight into their experiences and other people's experiences. And then in total, we recruited 4 participants. And Annie will tell you a bit more about that in a moment. But we did manage to get really, really rich data, which we hope you'll agree with and see coming up. So back over to you, Annie.
Thanks, Liz. So I want to talk a little bit more about photoelicitation, which was the methodology that we used. So photoelicitation essentially means the use of photographs in research interviews. And they can be provided by the researcher. For example, if a researcher wants to find out about the use of city centre shops, they could show the participants a set of photographs of the city centre. But more usually in photoelicitation, the participants are asked to take photographs which represent, which answer a question, a research question. And in our situation, we asked participants to take photographs which represented their experience as a carer during the pandemic restrictions. So with the participants, with each of the participants, we had 2 sessions. And the first was a kind of training session where we would explain the research, we'd explain the photography task. And when they were recruited, they knew that they were going to be taking part in a photography project. So we explained the photography task and we gave them some ideas about how they might want to approach that task and how they could use photographs to represent their experience. And the way that we did that was by showing a series of photographs, talking about what those photographs could represent, what the meanings were in the photographs, how you could read those photographs. And that we hoped would give them ideas for their own photographs. So we talked about the safety of the participants when taking photographs. And we also asked them not to take photos of people who were identifiable. So particularly not to take identifiable photographs of people that they cared for. So after that workshop session, they had between 7 and 10 days to take photographs. And then they sent those to us and we put them into a presentation and then we interviewed them using their own photographs as prompts for discussion. So we use photo elicitation because based on our previous experience, we feel it has 2 main advantages in a project like this. It allows participants to lead the interview and because they're taking photographs, the photographs are presented in the interview and they talk about their photographs. So they're able to capture their priorities through the photographs that they take, and that's what's discussed in the interview. And that means that concepts that are unexpected or concepts that are unknown to the researcher can be shared through this process and discussed in the interviews. And I think this means that the power imbalance that can exist between a researcher and a participant is reduced because the participants are the experts and they're the ones who are leading the research interviews. So another advantage that we felt this project benefited from was the time available for the participants to take their photographs. So they had this period of 7 to 10 days. And so they were able to go home, go back to their normal lives. They located their photography activity in their normal lives. And that meant that they were able to catch and capture their everyday experience, which is what we wanted to find out about. And their own experience was integrated and it was highlighted into our research. And that makes the data more rooted in the reality of the carers, their real daily experience. And I think this photograph illustrates that very well because it shows the participant was trying to tell us about the increasing domestic work that he had to do now that he was solely responsible because the person with dementia was not able to help, and this was his photograph of that experience. So all of the interviews that we did with participants and all the sessions we did were conducted by Zoom because of restrictions, limitations. And just to start talking about results, as Liz said, we recruited 4 people and altogether they submitted 25 photographs and 2 pieces of writing. So we did thematic analysis of the interview transcripts and we identified 9 main themes in those interviews. Because of limited time today, we're only going to talk about 4 of those themes. So we're going to talk about the benefits and challenges of rurality, deterioration and increased struggle for carers, creative solutions for managing COVID and dementia, and digital communication and services. So I'm going to hand back to Liz now.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, so you can see that for this first theme, which was deterioration of people living with dementia during lockdown and increased struggle for carers, the photos that were submitted to us were really, really powerful and evocative, and this one very much in particular. So what the participants tended to do when presenting their photos was contrast sort of the losses with the gains that they and their loved ones had seen in relation to the pandemic, and sort of how it had impacted their world and their loved ones' dementia and their loved ones' world. And all of the participants discussed that the dementia itself and the person's mental and physical health for the person living with dementia actually really deteriorated during lockdown. So I'm just going to read you a quote now about this photo. And this carer said to us, "That is her way. That's the way her condition has gone since lockdown. Downhill pretty quick. And looking at it the other way, it's been an uphill struggle for me. She's really deteriorated since March 2020. She just wanted to go out and for the routine to continue. I would say, we can't go out, we can't go out. And she's even lost the art of conversation. She's just got 3 or 4 phrases now. We could have carried on as normal a lot longer if it had been for lockdown, if it hadn't been for lockdown. Then in November 2020, we got a private carer. I decided we then needed carers to come in and look after her." So you can see it's really stark here. There was a real direct impact of lockdown on this person living with dementia, on their carer, and on the family as a whole, and possibly on the person's dementia, which again, how this resulted possibly in a premature move to obtaining more formal care that they may not have needed to do had they not gone into that lockdown situation. Next slide, please, Annie. So again, this is another participant who said, deteriorated is what I meant to say. Over the period of time, she was initially diagnosed with stage 2 dementia, and that was 2018. I can't remember the month, but it was sort of late summer, I think. And she was managing reasonably well. But then once we got into the lockdown period, she was keeping herself inside because that's what the wardens were telling her to do. And I felt that sort of cowed her in some ways. So that is a big part of the deterioration, is that she no longer can tell the difference between a £5 note, a £10 note, or a £20 note. And that does cause a great deal of sadness for me and her vulnerability, I guess. So again, you can see there that there really was an impact in terms of deterioration, and also the impact in terms of the sadness that created for the informal carer. And this was also noted by a service provider who said, with the families that we were supporting, within days, they noticed a deterioration in the cared for's mental health and well-being. And that exacerbated the situation for the main carers. So it was, how do you try and improve that? Next slide, please. So this was tied for all participants to a detrimental impact, not just on the informal carers, but also on in a variety of ways. So, for example, the increasing deterioration of the loved one's dementia ranged from having to provide more care, having to undertake more planning in terms of care, more activities, more housework and other tasks, and much more than they were doing so prior to lockdown because of this deterioration. And this is because a lot of the activities had previously been shared and planned together, and whereas now they were not able to do that. So this was frequently characterised as a struggle for these carers. And you can see this participant said, and for me as a carer now, at the time, actually Dad was really capable of walking. He's always been a really good walker. And over the last 16 months, his physical condition has deteriorated quite a lot. And I now have to choose walks really, really carefully. And they do have to be accessible and flat. Whereas before, he used to be able to go climbing up all sorts of hills and rocks and things. And so while we can't say that this deterioration would not have happened, we can't conclude that, but it does seem that people certainly perceived lockdown as causing certainly a more rapid deterioration for the people living with dementia. Next slide, please. So as I sort of alluded to on the previous slide, you can see though that the carers were determined to be really creative actually in finding solutions for managing the COVID and dementia for their loved ones. So amidst these struggles, that they often reported searching for sort of novel and creative ways to engage the people living with dementia in new activities, to maintain stimulation for them throughout the lockdown restrictions. And this really showed great resilience and ingenuity. So this was often done also in an effort to sort of reinstate normality for them and for the people living with dementia. So an example here is that they would use things that the person living with dementia really enjoyed when they had to do more challenging things because of lockdown, or more challenging conversations because of lockdown. So this participant said, and she still can connect with colour and flowers and things like sunrises and sunsets. She can still connect with those, and that's what I try to put in and balance that with the resistance that comes when we have to have difficult conversations about something. Next slide, please. And again, this is a really lovely example. So it wasn't just about finding ways to bring back normality. It was also about facilitating and strengthening existing bonds and relationships between the carers and their loved ones. So you can see from this participant, they're not just discussing being creative and in finding ways to stimulate her dad during the lockdown, or just to bring back normality. She's talking about reconnecting to activities that they enjoyed sharing together as father and daughter prior to COVID. So she says, I'd take some food and drink in the camper van, and I'd set up the camper van so that it was social. It was outside his usual small path. It was giving him some social stimulation. It was just ways that as a carer, I felt I could do something of the old sort of things that I used to do with Dad as a daughter, but also to give him some stimulation and to get him outside of the four walls, although it was probably pushing it a little bit in terms of what we should have been doing, but we definitely weren't going into cafes. So I think that's a really lovely novel way. Next slide, please. So again, this participant talked about the same thing as well, and trying in a similar way to reconnect, not just to normality of pre-lockdown life, but also to engage with his wife in activities that they previously shared and enjoyed together. So he in the top photo, he talks about the bowling green, which is where they used to go together quite a lot before lockdown, and how he'd sort of made adjustments there. And he said, the second game I played was at the bowling club, which is next to Asda, and she sat in the car park, and she could watch and I could keep an eye on her. And this is because she'd now deteriorated to a point where unfortunately she could not sit beside the bowling green anymore, so she had to sit in the car, and he knew she was safe and he could see her. So it was that novel way of continuing that shared enjoyment together. And then he also discussed in the bottom photo how she previously really enjoyed doing crossword puzzles with him, and that during lockdown she'd become less able to do them, or less interested in them. So he wanted to continue that, and he tried to find new similar activities that she could engage with. So he says, I bought yesterday a magic painting book to see if I can get her to, well, one of the ones where you just go over it with water, and then once it's dry, it disappears. And so she can do it again, because she won't probably know what she's done in the first instance. So we'll see if it stimulates her a bit. I haven't tried it yet, but we'll try. And if it does, we'll get one from Alzheimer's Society. Over to you, Annie.
Thanks, Liz. So another of the themes that we identified was the benefits and challenges of rurality. And as I said early on, when we started the research, I think both Liz and I assumed that living in a rural area was going to make life more challenging for carers. But we were surprised to hear a lot of positive comments from carers about living in a rural, semi-rural area. So, for example, the first quote, it's the countryside. Yeah, I mean, we're ever so lucky. I'm looking at trees now. Saturday morning, there was a deer in between my onions and my peas. So it wasn't just the appreciation of the countryside, it was also the kind of the activities that were involved in being out, living out in the countryside. So people talked about appreciating the views and appreciating the opportunity to get out into nature during the limited lockdown activity periods that were allowed in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. Participants talked about appreciating the quiet roads, which either made it easier when they were having to go and perform caring duties when they were travelling to visit the person that they cared for, but also quiet roads that made it safer for the person they cared for to be outside. And a number of the participants talked specifically about feeling sorry for people who lived in the city, people who lived in flats in the city particularly, and said that they couldn't imagine how awful it must have been for people who weren't able to get out into the countryside. And one participant talked about the person that he cared for who'd stopped wanting to go out and stopped wanting to go for walks, and he saw that lack of appreciation of nature. He identified that as a measure of deterioration in terms of their dementia. So the other interesting thing that we found was that carers felt like lockdown really created a level playing field in terms of rural and urban life. So in the second quote, whereas possibly at other times when it hasn't been COVID, I would say it's been a disadvantage because you can't get to groups, you can't do things, there isn't the transport network. So for me, actually, it's just been hugely advantageous compared to normal times. So lockdown for this participant particularly meant that the disadvantages of rural life, that is kind of the isolation, the distance to services, issues to do with transport, these things were less relevant because the services were closed anyway, and whether you lived 20 miles away or half a mile away, the services still weren't available. However, in this quote, you can see one service provider recognised that the limited resources and limited experience of complex care in rural areas was a disadvantage. So she said, so I can only imagine if someone, for example, was in a valley or a small village, the complex care services and support in the community would have been virtually nil. And not because the services weren't there, because the knowledge of what services are required when a person is diagnosed with dementia, and usually some comorbidity health conditions, what services are really needed and who's responsible and what was missing. And I just need to say that this photograph wasn't one that that service provider took. It was an image from another participant who talked about a kind of a trail of dolls and little scenarios that the village had put on. So another theme that we identified was the issue of digital communication and digital services. And this obviously was a big issue for everybody. So informal carers describe both challenges and benefits in the move onto online services. And this example is one of the benefits that the service provider identified. She says, I actually taught a couple of families to independently, as the weeks and months were going, maybe on month 4, to learn to do shopping online themselves then. So for some carers hadn't used digital communication before lockdown, like many people in the community. And that kind of being forced into having to learn those things and meant that they developed new skills. And those skills were useful during lockdown for things like communicating with family, communicating with services, doing shopping, so on. But those skills, continue to be valuable now that the pandemic's sort of in abeyance. So that was one of the positive things that was identified. But on the other hand, for people with dementia, a number of our participants talked about how confusing people with dementia found it trying to communicate through digital means. So this first quote, he's getting the hang of it now, actually, about understanding that you can see people through the computer, but he did really struggle with it. So for many people with dementia, they were confused about seeing people on screen and could only relate it to their experience of television. And they found it very difficult to understand how you could speak to somebody when previously their experience had been that TV was a one-way communication. And they found it hard to comprehend that what you were seeing was a real person in real time that you could talk to on the television, on the screen, and that it wasn't like television. But as this carer says, if they were able to understand that, if they were able to take that in, it meant that they were able to maintain some of their relationships. So they were able to speak to family and friends at a time when there wasn't really any other options. But that was kind of the more positive side of it. For other people's experience was much worse than that. So one of our participants talked about the difficulty of conducting a meeting with a professional online, and she said, and then trying to take her through a mini mental assessment online, trying to do a cognitive test online. Yes, give your mother a piece of paper and a pen and ask her to draw the face of a clock. Well, really, how's that going to work with someone who is hardly able to remember? She doesn't know what time of day it is. So it wasn't, the assessment wasn't, didn't achieve what it aimed to achieve, because it wasn't the test that would have been conducted face to face was the person with dementia wasn't even really able to get to that point, because they couldn't get across the difficulty of understanding the digital medium, and the assessment was really completely impossible. So that was the other side of the idea about moving to digital and online communication. So I'm going to pass back to Liz again.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, so In terms of implications for future research, so because of the difficulties that we faced, we decided that we should connect with other researchers in the field who were exploring experiences of informal carers during lockdown. And we found that they were actually having the same recruitment challenges as we were. So we found it really helpful to sort of link up with them, and we all also found that there was a real underrepresentation of the direct experiences of informal carers in the literature, and a real over-reliance on the views and perceptions of third-party stakeholders, so sort of providers of care and commissioners. And so by missing this sort of key group in terms of the impact on policy, their voice was missing from that. So we think it's really important to conduct more of this research with informal carers, because their voice really needs to be present in any decisions about policy, and at the moment it doesn't really seem that way. So we also found that in terms of funding future projects, so because all the studies so we connected with 3 other studies, and because everybody experienced these same delays, what that means is funders can look at that and say, well, you know, you didn't complete the study on time, you had to change your ethics application. So it can be really detrimental in terms of funding that gets awarded to you. So that is something that needs to be considered. In terms of the loss of the opportunity to recruit face-to-face, that was also an impact factor for all the people we connected with, all the other studies, and we all decided it was more to do with losing the personal touch and building rapport with participants and with service providers. So it was definitely a hindrance to all the studies, but it did mean that we widened our net, and obviously we then decided to include the service providers. So we had the informal carer perspective and the service providers all in one study, which again is not something you see a lot of in this area. So that was really helpful and insightful. One of the main problems, of course, with moving to online recruitment and online interviewing is it probably did impact on our participant demographics and how many people we managed to recruit. So there are lots of people who have limited digital literacy, lots of people who still don't have access to the internet. I think it's about 2 million, something like that, in Manchester alone. So we do really need to think about this going forward. So what we are suggesting is that in future, these sorts of studies, people should perhaps offer different types of recruitment. So don't just have a one size fits all. Make an offer of a face-to-face interview or online or telephone, and then hopefully you sort of removing some of those barriers for people to recruitment. Obviously we couldn't do the face-to-face in the pandemic for obvious reasons, but also that not having access to support groups can present challenges in recruitment. Another problem with that is that many of the support organisations that moved to online during the pandemic have now stayed online or closed completely. So that's really worrying, because there's not a lot of support out there for informal carers. So we need to think about how we can get those groups going again, support them, and maybe conduct some research around that too. We did actually write a blog with the other study researchers that we connected with. So if you would be interested in reading that and having a look at some of the recommendations we made, I've put the link on that slide for you there. In terms of going forward, so as well as collaborating with other researchers, we would really recommend giving participants that choice of how they are recruited to the study, how they take part in the study, be more inclusive, and also in terms of future research, we really need to think about upscaling studies like this. So this is obviously a very small study, very small sample, but we really need to understand the experiences of informal carers. And the reason for that is they make up the majority of carers in the UK, and they are a huge, huge asset to our economy, to people living with dementia, to our communities, to our support services, and we really need to make sure that they are supported and able to maintain providing that informal care, which is not just beneficial for the economy, but is really beneficial for the people living with dementia. And we know from the research that the majority of people do prefer to stay at home, and so by doing that and supporting those people in those long-term studies, looking at the long-term impact, we can hopefully work to support those people. So I'm going to post that link into the chat in a second, and then I'd like to hand over to Amina, who would like to talk to you about her dreams for future research and her experiences of being an informal carer. So I'm just going to hand over to Amina now. Oh, you're on mute, Amina.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't see anybody and I can't hear, and I can only hear what people are saying, but not have any sense of the community that may be listening to what's being said. And that for me echoes what pandemic was like. Particularly that Mum went through her deterioration quite significantly in that time. And I think it was a very difficult time to be living without the support of statutory services, particularly health, who just seemed to disappear without anything else in place. The reference to the attempted mental assessment. She'd never used a computer. She'd had no understanding of how to interact with that forum. And actually was speaking to me because I can't, what is happening? And as a result of this, that was the only contact that we had from statutory. I think it's really important that we also find out what happened to people who didn't make it through. The pandemic, because contact with the local dementia group, because they didn't survive in that environment. And I wonder what data is being collated where and where they lose their lives in an account. I want to talk also about some of the things that I've been trying, where we're beginning to try and establish contact with people and looking at the levels of deterioration that have gone on and no assessment made, no changes. But the additional burden as well is be in their best interest, or for the person to be cared for. And with the fact that social services are primarily online, and healthcare services are the voluntary sector is not connected to either of those two agencies in a formal way. That's really an important area that needs some research taken forward on it. To say is just to, I hope, and today I sit on the floor in my love chaos. I have no power by someone else. As I sit amongst the piles of objects consuming every surface and every space, I notice broken chains, watch bits of china, old pins and buttons. Each piece seems to represent perhaps a fantasy that can never be fulfilled by the owner. Concurrently, I'm able I am unable also to repair these items as my metaphor to be. I sense the intense pain, confusion, and powerlessness to recreate that which is truly broken inside her.
Hi, Amina. I think you were reading from a
We battle
poem.
in this
Is that right?
space and confusion. That's right. It's a really powerful space for me because that's how it is and has been. And I do not want to, not it's our outcomes from pandemic is that mum has now severe level dementia. And as such, no one has come forward support just to go to social services, and it's very abandoned space, and there needs to be a place where research already that there were things that were positive. I think it's important to also account for what didn't work. There is one to say, I'm mindful of time. I've begun some work with people, inviting carers into a space where they can begin to talk to each other and connect and know that I've sent you a document which looks at a primary evaluation after the first 6 weeks of that program going forward. It demonstrates how much people need to be in contact and to be listened to and have space to talk. That's about all I can say right in that certain limitations by the fact I just have my own face on the screen. Sorry.
Thanks very much for your contribution. Thanks very much, Anne. Oh, Claire, you're on mute.
Thank you, Amna, for sharing. And it is difficult, isn't it, when you can't see people's faces on screen. But we're very much listening. We were very much listening to you, so thank you. And there's 13 of us all together in this call. So we're going to take questions now, and there's a question that came through from Thomas. I'm happy for you to go on.
It's about the disconnection. The disconnection is
very challenging, I think. Yeah, we're just going to take a question. Thomas, I can read this out, or would you like to unmute yourself?
No.
Yeah, sure, I can unmute myself.
Thank you.
I'll go back to the question myself because
Scrolling back.
Then. So yeah, it was about the method, because I did a very similar research actually in the same period of time using the same participants, except I went for carers just generally in England. And I used graphic elicitation, which is the drawing
Thomas.
elicitation. And I just wondered, because I had a lot of trouble getting people to get on board with the drawing aspect. Did you have a similar problem with photo elicitation, because photography is maybe less daunting in terms of artistic merit and things like that?
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I'm sure Annie can add to this, but I think it may well have been an issue, but for the participants who actually did get involved, it seemed to be less of a concern for them. So it's hard to say really, because without knowing the people who were sort of put off from being recruited to the study, it's hard to sort of figure that out. I think we did have, and Annie will correct me if I'm wrong, I think we did have a couple of emails from people saying they were a bit unsure about the photo taking. So I think you're right. I think there's a possibly a bit of not skepticism, that's the wrong word, but maybe some slight fears there around, you know, am I doing this right, or what's expected of me? And I think there was a little bit of hesitancy perhaps from some of the participants at first, but once we said, you know, you can use your phone, you can use a camera, you could use a disposable camera, they were like, oh great, okay, I'm happy with that. So it's really interesting, the method that you describe. Actually, I've not heard of that, and I'd be really interested to see your findings from that. So it'd be great if you could sort of share a link to any data or results that you've written up, because that sounds like a really interesting method. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Annie?
Well, I'm going to ask whether Amina wants to say anything about it from her perspective as a participant, but just briefly, I think because photography is just totally ubiquitous now, that everybody's using their cameras. No, I've done a couple of photo elicitation projects where people, people who were older didn't find it a barrier. You know, they all had smartphones anyway and were taking photographs. So I think there is a difference between drawing and photography. But I've also done drawing projects with people, and I suppose how I feel, and not everybody loves art, not everybody wants to draw, not everyone wants to take photographs, but I think one of the things I think, one of the ways that we capitalised on photo elicitation was, you know, this idea of people having an activity to do during a time when there wasn't very much to do. It didn't operate quite as well with this, but we also did, at the same time, we were doing another photo elicitation project using social media. And that was definitely something that people just wanted activities, they wanted things to do. So I think it's a real mixture, but I don't know whether Amina wants to say anything about it, whether Anne wants to say anything about it. I think you're on mute again, Anne. I don't know if you want to unmute and say how you felt about doing the photography project. I'm not sure.
Okay, maybe give us, if she's still there, to give us some time. I've got another question about partnership working. How did you approach that partnership working in this project?
That was quite a challenge, really. I mean, we spent a lot of time, particularly when the project was in a small geographical location. I spent a lot of time finding organisations that worked with carers, and finding organisations that worked with people with dementia, and contacting, speaking to them to try and find out how we could work together. And even though a lot of them were very interested and very willing, they didn't have any opportunities to talk to carers, really. You know, their contact with carers was very limited because their services had closed down, and sometimes staff weren't working on in those services anymore. And then the other thing was, I think because it was such a short project, we didn't really have a lot of time to build those networks before we started the project. And I think that is a key thing that we want to take forward in terms of learning. So, for example, the Alzheimer's Society would have been a really key partner, but in order to work with the Alzheimer's Society in the research project, the project had to be submitted to their research team, and the research team had to approve it. And you know, during the entire length of the project, I didn't manage to get the research team to approve the project. So I think had we already had those links with them, and had we been able in a longer project to kind of build up towards doing research, then we might have been able to make contact with more participants. But you know, a 6-month funded project doesn't really allow you to do anything more than just a kind of a pilot. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else on that, Liz.
No, I think you covered it, Annie, to be honest, but I did want to just quickly acknowledge what Amina was saying about faces in Zooms and such, and just to apologise about that. And personally, for me, Amina, I'm one of these people who, for some reason, Zoom just decides to cut out randomly if I have my video on. So I made the decision to not have the video on so that you could all hear me. And I do really hear you and acknowledge that that can be really difficult for people. And I'm really sorry about that. And I think there's a wider discussion here around what you've raised there, and it's a really important conversation that we all perhaps need to have in more depth. And also I think there's also another factor in that there's a lot of people who, when they know something's going to be recorded, that they don't want to be recorded and have their image on the internet, because this will be made publicly available. And I think there's so many issues around this, but it's so important that we do have these discussions. And I just want to thank you for raising that, and you know, just acknowledge that it's something I think as a research community we all need to think a bit more about as well, in terms of engaging with people. So thank you for raising that. I hope you can still hear me, and I hope I'm not cutting out. So thank you for raising it.
Yeah, we can hear you, Liz. Thank you. So we've just come up to 3 o'clock, which is the end of the session. I can't see any further questions, but as you say, we're dealing with those technology issues on this call, and that's also come up in the research, hasn't it, in terms of connecting and disconnecting with people. There's a message just coming through. Thank you so much for sharing this research and findings. This is from Sarah Campbell. Very important to hear how it's been for family carers and people living with dementia in their own words and images during this time. And other comments coming in. Thank you all for the interesting research. That's a very positive note to end on. So thank you, the 3 of you, for presenting today, Annie, Liz and Anne Amner. and for Micra and for Emily for supporting the session. It's been recorded and that will be posted out, I think, Emily, yeah, be available, the link for everyone to listen to and pass on to interested people.